So thanks so much for the introduction. It's fabulous to be here and welcome everyone. So we're going to talk about the industrial clusters. No doubt we've got quite a mixed audience today of people who are wondering what these are and people who've been involved in the development of them for as long as they can remember. So I'm going to start out with just a brief introduction of what the industrial clusters are all about. Then we're going to hand over to our wonderful panel to just explain briefly what they're involved in. And then we've got a question and answer session that we'd love you all to participate in. So question and answers are being done on Slido. I'll remind you of this later, but if you scan that QR code on the screen, you can type your question in and then we might get to it in the later part of the session. So just as an introduction, I wanted to explain why the UK's major industrial regions really matter for the UK's decarbonisation ambitions and why the plans for developing these regions really matter. My role is to lead the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge, and if you haven't heard of it, this is £210 million of public money and about £500 million in total when we add in the industry contribution. And the programme's delivered through UK Research and Innovation. And our goal was to kickstart the decarbonisation of the UK's major industrial clusters, emphasising carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, where getting together to collaborate to get infrastructure at the right scale is actually quite crucial and difficult. So why are we focusing on clusters as the starting point for industry decarbonisation in the UK? The whole point is that if we decarbonise this small number of industrial regions, then that's affected half of the UK's industry emissions. So it has a really material impact if we do this properly. And it allows us to get the decarbonisation infrastructure at the right scale, and it allows all of the industries in a region to participate in decarbonisation activities rather than having to, wait for something to come along and join, in the sort of 2040s and 2050s. So I want to make sure that you understand where these major industrial clusters are and what their goals are. So they are located around the country. So we have a major decarbonising cluster in South Wales, and then in the northwest, and in Scotland, and in Teesside, and in Humberside. So all of these regions will be very familiar to you, and their plans very familiar by the end of this session, and people are going to talk about all of those. The idea of the UK is it is our policy to have 4 major decarbonised industrial clusters in place by the end of the decade, and we are on track to achieve that. We want to decarbonise the regions, but also do other things like create, protect and future-proof these regions, so things like having skilled jobs in the area. And we want to make sure that the regions remain competitive as they decarbonise or close down, which is a really horrendous scenario to think about. So we're really looking at the competitiveness, positivity around this. So the clusters are really looking at the plans for developing the infrastructure they're going to need and making sure they've got the right stakeholders involved in their plans. And now I'm going to hand over to each of the panel members to take us through what their plans are. So I'll start off with you, Richard, and then we'll pass on down the line, and we've got about 3 minutes each.
That's
Thanks.
fine. 3 minutes, Bryony. Okay. This is exciting, isn't it? This is fantastic. The industrial clusters that we have in the UK are the beating heart of our economy, right? So it's brilliant that we've got a great turnout, and it's also brilliant that you have so many on the stage that all want to focus on decarbonisation. Bryony, as you said, I'm Richard Gwilliam. I'm the chair of the Humber Energy Board. The Humber Energy Board is a cross-regional board that brings in the academic sector, the public sector and the private sector to work on our shared priority in the Humber, which is to transform our economy through decarbonisation. And each of these industrial clusters has a unique and critical and important role, and we should be clear from the outset that they all need to decarbonise for us to meet net zero. From a Humber perspective, I describe us as the engine room of the UK. So about 20% of all the power that we consume in this country is generated in our region. About a third of all the refinery products that we use They come from the 2 principal refineries we have up there. About a fifth of all the gas that we import into the UK makes its way through pipelines in the region. This is a strategically important national asset. But the consequence of the importance of that role is that it has a really high carbon footprint, and as an industrial cluster, more CO2 goes into the atmosphere from the Humber than anywhere else, which is why we have a really clear plan, and we're going to get onto the cluster plans in a moment, about how we can decarbonise that. And what's been really fantastic for me is that we've brought industry, academic sector, the public sector together with a shared view on how we decarbonise a critical industrial economy, so it can continue to keep the lights on for the country and reduce the CO2 emissions that are generated as a result.
Fantastic. Matthew, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bryony. So I'm Matthew Rhodes, and I lead the Black Country Industrial Cluster. And just a little bit of context to start with, and then I'll talk about what we're doing. The Black Country is slightly different from the other industrial clusters. I think we all say that. Chris said they're all different. We're probably the UK's oldest industrial cluster. I was amazed to discover as part of this project that if you go back to 1620, which is quite a long time ago, there were 20,000 metalworking businesses within 15 kilometres of Dudley Castle. So it was the heart of the industrial economy of the UK, even in the 17th century. And even a century ago, there were 300 coal mines in the Black Country, because basically coal was right on the surface there. So the whole urban infrastructure and the culture of the Black Country is built around fossil fuels. And unlike the other clusters who are on the stage today, we don't have a nice coast and a lot of wind capacity or mountains to build on. So the problem I think we've been confronting with our industrial decarbonisation plan isn't just industrial decarbonisation. It's about deindustrialisation as well, actually. And it's a massive cultural problem, because all those people who live in the Black Country and in the wider West Midlands are there because of fossil fuels. That's the geography, and that's the reality of our area. And so it's a more difficult challenge, I'd say, in many ways. The other point, just as part of context of our cluster, is that instead of a small number of very large sites, if you take, for example, British Steel in Scunthorpe, the carbon emissions of that one plant are bigger than the entire West Midlands, I think. We've got thousands of medium-sized businesses. These are metal, chemicals businesses, construction-type businesses. A lot of them are family-owned. A lot of them are very committed to the place and to the geography. So we're typically working with 3,000 companies, not 3 companies or 30 companies. It's a large numbers problem. So what's come out of this programme for us? I think there are 3 things I'd highlight, 3 really positive things. First of all, and this is a human sort of thing, the support that we feel we've had from the government, actually, in Bryony and Innovate UK has been tremendous for the region, a region that has felt forgotten, actually, for nearly 50 years. And that's really helpful and important, and it matters. And it's given a sense of confidence and purpose to people, and decarbonisation is now seen as a positive thing, something where you can innovate and you can actually build your business rather than it's going to destroy your business. So I think that's really good, and we're working together to do that. So our cluster it was part funded by Innovate UK up to just over a year ago, but we were asked to continue by the private sector. Those 3,000 companies that I'm talking about are now funding our cluster to continue because they think it's an important topic. Which I think is tremendously encouraging. The other two things, we're developing projects, so we've got megawatt scale solar PV going in. Actually, as I speak, it's going on roofs, it's going onto factories. We're looking at district energy schemes. We've got the world's first zero carbon brick factory in our area, although they're waiting for hydrogen and they're doing a bit of offsetting to make the zero carbon claim for the time being. But these are all great projects that we're happy to promote. And the final thing is we were successful in persuading DESNA and the UK government to invest just over £30 million in a pilot project for business energy advice, because it's a large numbers problem. If you've got 3,000 energy-intense businesses, you can't just put in a single piece of infrastructure and decarbonise those businesses. And we're not going to get hydrogen in the middle of the country for maybe 20 or 30 years, are we? So we need to do stuff now, and we need to avoid the perfect being the enemy of the good. So we've got some money to actually go out and do energy audits and subsidise incentivise people to, or grants effectively for them to buy energy efficient equipment, which is great, and I hope the government's going to roll that out nationally. And we've so far, I think, engaged getting on for 1,000 businesses across the West Midlands in that, over 200 in the Black Country itself. Okay, and finally, in terms of a couple of things that I think as a result of this project we could do better as a country, one is regulations and support for clusters like mine, really, or groups of companies at the scale of 10 companies, 20 companies, 30 companies, to work together to decarbonise. We have an energy regulator, energy regulation, which is designed for very large systems, and you should make it easy for one company to sell electricity to the next company, for example, when you have electricity. And we need a national industrial strategy as well, but I'm sure I've used my time. Thank you very much.
So I think we talked about the clusters all being different, but I hope you're going to see the sense of passion of all the panel members as we go forward. So Philippa, over to you, Scotland.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. So I'm the CEO of NECCUS, which is the Industrial Decarbonisation Alliance for Scotland. So that's bringing together industry, so large global players, small micro SMEs, covering the full chain of decarbonisation, so supply chain and universities as well. In Scotland, we've got a fantastic opportunity because offshore of Scotland, we have probably 2/3 of the CO2 storage capacity for the UK. So the UK storage capacity is about 78 gigatons, that's billion tonnes. So that's hundreds of years of UK emissions can be stored safely and securely underneath the North Sea. And the funding from Innovate UK actually drove forward a cluster plan in a way that it wouldn't have happened otherwise without that funding in Scotland. And we have a situation where we have a few, we're very lucky in that we have some large emitters which are located along an existing pipeline, which means that we've been part of the funding enabled us to look at that pipeline and whether we can reuse it rather than having to build a new one, which means you reduce the costs. And this comes back to the collaboration piece as well, because what we need is to work together. These are big infrastructure projects. You can't have one industry trying to do it on its own. You need everyone working together. So in Scotland, we have some large emitters in the central belt. We have a pipeline that would go up to St Fergus in the northeast. And then we have other pipelines that we can reuse to take the CO2 offshore to store offshore, as I've mentioned. So the value of this has been huge. The other thing is, you talked about coal mining. There was a very destructive and unmanaged transition in Scotland away from coal mining, which you're already also aware of. And we can't afford to do that again. We have industry in Scotland that employs thousands of people, and it supports many thousands of other people in jobs because of those jobs. So we need a just transition for those people. And also we need to keep manufacturing. We need to be making things in this country. So I think we should be talking less about, not less, but we've been talking about the energy transition for a long time. But I think we also need to be talking about industrial transformation and a transition for industry from high carbon emitting industries. And the other point that we should make is that not all industrial emissions come from energy sources. Some of the CO2 emissions are from processing, and that's, for example, cement making. So there really is no other way to decarbonise other than through CCS. I'll say more later about what we actually did in the cluster plan, hopefully.
Okay. Thanks so much. Chris?
Hi, thanks. So I think I'd like to touch on what I think makes the Tees cluster unique and what we're doing to decarbonise it. But I would like to say at first how the cluster planning process cemented and enhanced more than a decade of existing collaboration. And I know we're going to touch on later what we're doing sort of subsequently on the cluster plans. But it has been a really, really positive experience for us. Our cluster plan brought together 60 businesses across the Tees Valley and looked at, we initially thought cluster planning for us in Teesside was about when are we getting CCUS, who's building it, and who's going to use it. But actually, it turned out to be 3 key technologies, CCUS being one of them, and they're all interdependent on each other. So you've got carbon capture, utilisation and storage, low carbon hydrogen, that can be blue, green, turquoise, I don't care about the colour as long as it meets the government's low carbon hydrogen standard. And you've got green energy, and that's green energy from the from offshore wind in the North Sea. It's green energy from new nuclear that's coming to the region. It's green energy from carbon capture enabled gas peaking power plants like the net zero Teesside Power, which is effectively the anchor project for carbon capture in the region, as it will not only offset the low time, the sort of off periods for North Sea wind, but it will also provide compression to the ultra dense state in which CCUS will be pumped under the North Sea. And I would say as well, the Teesside cluster is part of the East Coast cluster. So East Coast cluster covers not all of the CCUS activity in Humber, but a good amount of CCUS activity in Humber, plus the decarbonisation of the Teesside cluster as well. So you've got these 3 key technologies which help us. They're going to help us do 2 things. One, we're going to green Teesside's existing industry. This is, we as a region and we as an authority, our job is economic development, taking one of the most deprived parts of the UK and creating more and better jobs. And the energy transition really helps us, it's a really, really key part of a key enabler in doing that. So there'll be more. So we take our existing industries, chemicals, process, energy, we help them to become green, while also enabling the new green industries of the future. That is existing adding to our offshore wind base with the Saya wind factory on Teesworks. It means sustainable fuels projects like those by Alphanar, Willis Aviation, and several more. And it also means the battery supply chain with companies. I know both Green Lithium and Tees Valley Lithium are represented as part of our pavilion here today. So, am I right for time? All right. Right. I love the sound of my own voice, but I feel my time has come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. David.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon everybody. Very pleased to be here. So I think I'm going to complete our geographical road trip of the UK by talking about the Northwest. So one of the things we've all talked about so far today is the collaboration between all the clusters. There is just a little bit of competition as well, which is no such bad thing. So Richard might have the most emissions, but I've got the most people in the Northwest. So there are more people employed in manufacturing in the Northwest of the UK than any other region. It's about 350,000 people. Now, they get out of bed every day, go to work to do 2 things. So the first is they make stuff. And when they make stuff, they are producing economic wealth. And that is how we have powered our economy for the last 200-300 years in the UK, since it all started in the Black Country back in the 17th century. But at the same time, they produce carbon. And our industrial economy has essentially had a symbiotic link between carbon production and economic wealth production since the Industrial Revolution. So what we are looking to do in the Northwest, as are all the clusters, essentially break that link. What we're looking to do essentially is transform our existing industry into low carbon industry, and at the same time attract further inward investment by global companies who want to come to the region because of the low carbon infrastructure which we're putting in place. So across the Northwest, a whole range of different projects. The one which I'm focused on is a large scale carbon capture and hydrogen project, full train integrated project, which I can talk about for hours, but I won't do. And essentially this has got 2 conjoined systems. So we have a carbon capture and storage system that is taking carbon dioxide essentially as a waste product. Think of that as a waste disposal system. Carbon dioxide goes in at one end, down a pipeline, buried deep underneath the seabed in perpetuity, geological timescales, and taken out of our economy. We then have a hydrogen system. So we are producing low carbon hydrogen at scale, and we're utilising that to decarbonise existing industry. So it's automotive, it is glass, it is chemicals, it is food and drink, all of those sort of large manufacturing companies across the region that can fuel switch from natural gas today to low carbon hydrogen. They will utilise that hydrogen, and we're also going to utilise that hydrogen to convert existing power stations which utilise natural gas today. They're going to use hydrogen in future. And the way we're going to manage that is we have large-scale hydrogen storage underground in salt caverns where we can store vast amounts of hydrogen. So when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we turn on our hydrogen power stations utilising that underground hydrogen storage. And the connection between the 2 systems is we're anchored with what we call blue hydrogen. So that is hydrogen manufactured from natural gas. When you undertake that process, your carbon dioxide is your waste product. That underpins our CCS system. So as a combined end-to-end project, multi-billion pounds, about 30 industrial partners. We've been at it since late 2016. Bryony came along with the most fabulous injection of funding right at the right time to sort of get us on an inflection path. We've now had several hundred people for the last few years doing all of the engineering work, all of the consenting work, all of the commercial structuring. This is not simple commercially. And we're aiming for a final investment decision on the HyNet core infrastructure in the second half of this year, subject to final government processes.
Fabulous, thank you very much. I should say that we've also got a cluster in Scotland, in South Wales. They're not able to be with us today, but they've got a lot of exciting stuff going on there. A very complicated cluster stretching across about 100 miles of South Wales coast, and with lots of big industries involved in that. So over to the Q&A. I think I'm supposed to remind you that we've got a QR code on here, and if you want to type in a question on your phone, please go ahead and do that, and we'd love to hear from you. So just kicking off, I think one of the things in the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge that we tried to achieve is not just developing plans and shoving them in a drawer and forgetting we ever did that piece of work. So I'd really like to explore with some of the panel how we're actually keeping the cluster plan alive and relevant. Richard, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, of course, Bryony, thank you. I think one of the principal legacies from the cluster plan in the Humber actually has been the creation of the Humber Energy Board. The process, if I talk about the process first rather than the plan, to sort of bring a bid together across the region to try and compete for funding to do something, drove greater levels of cooperation than we've ever seen probably in the region. You put in the same room organisations which are instinctively competitive against each other and get them to try and rally around a common solution. And for me, you're right. I mean, there's a plan, a really detailed plan and a roadmap that we can build out from, and I'll come to that. But the overriding legacy has been to engender a collaborative approach to solving a problem that we all need to solve. And I know, I meant the point earlier, we've been through the whole panel. Each of these industrial clusters has to decarbonise for order for us to meet net zero. David talked, there's a bit of competition, and there always is, and that drives sort of, competitive tension and behaviours and hopefully push the cost down. But we've all got to get over the finish line before 2050 together. And but for me, going into a room with a whole series of different projects that we don't normally engage with and talking about actually what do we have in common, how do we try and solve these things, was the principal enduring legacy of the plan itself. And the Energy Board is the embodiment of that. And what we agreed when the process came to an end is that the Energy Board would effectively be the custodian of that plan, to take those mandates that you remember we developed forward and make sure that we have some accountability back to the region about how we're going to be delivering that. And the Energy Board now has status. There's 2 devolution deals that are being worked through at the moment in the Humber. The Energy Board has a specific role on cross-regional collaboration in both of those deals. And we've ended up having an observer reputation from government on that board to give some accountability to the delivery of the plan. So the plan is the sort of the thing that we're all aspiring towards. The delivery vehicle was also delivered by the plan and will help us get over the line. So collaboration and having a clear direction has been 2 principal takeaways.
Great, thanks very much. Philippa, would you like to come in on this?
Yes, so I mentioned that we have several large emitters around the central belt near to this pipeline. But we also have dispersed emitters too, and these might be also large emitters. So we have a cement plant which is further down the coast, and then we've got a range of dispersed smaller emitters. So what we're looking at is how we can pull these together and connect these up to the cluster, which is based up in St Fergus, really, for the storage. And this may be different routes, so looking at different modes of transport as well as pipeline. We can look at rail and road, and offshore too we're looking at shipping. So we've got a strong interest, so we've set up a maritime group recently looking at how the ports and the shipping companies can engage with this and what is needed in terms of regulation and policy. And then there's interesting sectors. So, I mean, you may or may not be aware that Scotland has a target to reach net zero by 2045, so we have to do it before the rest of the UK. which focuses minds a bit. And there's been a growth recently, for example, in energy from waste plant. Now, these can lead to negative emissions, which helps us with offsetting some of the sectors that are harder to abate, such as agriculture and aviation. So we need all of these things in the mix. So what we need to be looking at is how to continue to collaborate and look at options for these other industries.
Fantastic, thank you. Oh, someone in the room has asked an interesting follow-up question of, does the current system of competition between the clusters and projects work? Who'd like to come in on that? Chris?
It sort of does, I think. So there are times when we as the clusters have thought, actually, yes, we're going to compete against each other. There's no love lost between, for example, the Tees and the Humber when it comes to inward investment. But when it comes to industrial decarbonisation, collaboration has ended up working far more than competition. So actually, these early stages, potentially competition between us rather than supporting us all to go at our own speed. I don't think the competition was necessarily the best approach there. However, the competition for the race to being the first fully decarbonised industrial cluster may well end up yielding a positive impact, not just for net zero and the environment, but for net zero manufacturing and UK PLC, so that you can see it from either side. That was a bit of a public sector answer, I admit that.
Anyone else want to come in? David, please.
Yeah, sure. So, look, I'm speaking from the pleasurable position of being sort of successful in our competitive process when we're talking about cluster sequencing, which is the government's process of identifying which clusters of those first 4 to be built by 2030 are going to get built first. So, government selected 2 projects in 2 clusters in 2021, which was East Coast Cluster and HyNet to be their 2 Track 1 clusters. Now, I do understand why we need a level of competition. There is a limited fiscal pot of money available, and government needs to sort of spend that wisely and be accountable to taxpayers for doing that. And I think the methodology for assessment and selection has been, I think, sensible and has been necessary, but it has been quite protracted. It has been quite difficult, and as the second phase of competition, we've had to pit projects against each other within the cluster, which, from different sectors, which I don't think has been entirely helpful. So I think what we'd like to move towards in future is, yes, still a level of competitive-based process, but quicker, perhaps lighter touch, and more focus on value for money and meeting a threshold rather than just beating that other cluster or that other project. So I do understand why we need it. It has got us where we have, which is helpful. I would like to see that shift a little bit moving forward.
Yeah, Richard, please.
Yeah, I'm not going to stoke the flames. Humber Teesside competition. We have enough infighting within the Humber, so we don't need the wider region to sort that out for us. I think the point I wanted to make, though, is that you're right. Everyone's right. This is a competitive process. When you have a funding pot, a limited funding pot, people go into competition to try and see if they can get their hands on that. But government never conceived it with competition in mind, and they were always at pains, if you recall, to talk about it's sequencing, it's about an order, it's about a process, and everyone of course wants to go first and make sure their project's top early mover advantage, etc. I think for the regions that weren't successful in the first round, and I've spoken quite openly about the Humber and the disappointment of us not being part of Track 1, what we do need to see is not just the lessons learned as the projects start to materialise in the other clusters, but a clearer roadmap from government as to when the next phases are coming along. We had some great news last year when Track 2 announced, obviously, colleague in Scotland, but obviously Viking in the Humber was a real great step forward, and we know that with Track 1 expansion, as you've already talked about, the sort of the idea that you bring infrastructure down to the Humber will help make that happen. But there's been a little bit of hesitancy recently, and we'd hoped this stuff would have materialised by now and hasn't quite. So the way that you try and get through this is providing clarity on what the long-term roadmap is.
Thanks. And I think, what I would say is, having worked with all these clusters over a period of quite a few years now, I think we have seen genuine collaboration between them. That is so important, because what we've always recognised in the UK is that one of the best ways of getting costs down is to share our learnings. And we do see people doing that. So although there is competition, you don't see people refusing to talk to other people and share important lessons that they've learned. I think that's really vital to success moving forward. And everybody wants to succeed as long as they're succeeding themselves. I think that's probably the way it goes. We've got another question come up on Slido, and I'm going to ask Matthew to talk about this. He's really the perfect person to address it. It's around how are these plans actually linking to the non-industrial cluster sites. So looking at some of the dispersed sites and how are they going to decarbonise. And of course the industries you're working with are really relevant to that situation. And I know you're involved in dispersed site decarbonisation. So over to you.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was quite pleased about with our cluster was we did begin to be approached by businesses outside the Black Country, but within the West Midlands. So, for example, Cemex is actually the largest carbon emitter, so cement manufacturer near the West Midlands, and they were very keen to get involved with our cluster. So there's direct interaction like that. And then, of course, Innovate UK has funded the local industrial decarbonisation plan this year, and we've got, I think, 13 mini clusters like the Black Country around the country that are all now looking at ways they can decarbonise. And it is a different problem. You don't have this sequencing issue, you don't have the carbon capture issue, but you have got a lot in common again. I think the model that we followed for these 6 industrial clusters, we can extend to these other industrial clusters. So we're working now with Northern Ireland, we're working with the South West, some of our partners are working with Yorkshire, and there's opportunities for everyone to do the kind of things that these clusters have been doing. That goes back to what I was saying in my 3-minute talk. I think this for the first time is indicative of the UK thinking a little bit collectively about industrial futures and industrial strategy, which can only be a good thing.
Great, thanks very much. David?
Yeah, so we're also working on a large-scale industrial cluster in the Peak District, which is not sort of hugely out in the public domain yet, but is rapidly becoming so. So the Peak District is home to about 40% of the UK's cement and lime industry, and it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So the vast majority of carbon dioxide coming out of North Staffordshire, Derbyshire, the High Peak, comes from about half a dozen big cement and lime producers. And the challenge is, they're right in the heart of the country. How do you decarbonise them? So what we were able to do was actually utilise some of the funding from HyNet to look at how do you expand HyNet over the medium term, and actually seeing HyNet essentially as, I shouldn't call it this, but as the disposal system, and being able to sort of plumb in other clusters into that. We've essentially sort of started to look at the Peak District as a satellite cluster and how we can transport the CO2 from those industrial emissions to a coastal cluster. And I know some of the other clusters are looking at that as well. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I think one of the things people are really interested in is finding out how you're attracting inward investment into the cluster. I know you've all got experience of thinking through this, so who'd like to go first? Richard, perhaps?
I can touch briefly on that one. Yeah, of course. I guess I'm in danger of just repeating the word collaboration an awful lot, but I'm going to, irrespective, because the economic fortunes of the Humber have sort of long been linked to the rise and fall of the tide. So the estuary that sort of defines our region is where the sort of principal economic drivers are. And thinking just beyond the industrial cluster strategy, one thing that we've done in the region is collaborate really closely with the Freeport. So I see the Energy Board and the Freeport almost as like the economic shop window for the Humber. These are the areas that you can come to and understand about the scale of the opportunity that exists. But of course, to allow that to happen, you also need close collaboration with the local authorities as well, and who quite often preside over or are dealing with queries on disposal of land, etc. So trying to come up with this coherent proposition that brings an economic value to industrial decarbonisation but recognises the other economic drivers in the region is really important. So I'm probably going to answer every single question, Bryony, in the next session using the word collaboration, but that has been key for us.
Chris first and then David, please.
I think Richard hit the nail on the head with Freeports. There's a reason why they seem to have cropped up in many of the areas that also have industrial clusters. It's about they're a government vehicle for effectively brownfield regeneration. They're far more about economic development than they are about trade, and that aligns really, really closely with the economic development side of net zero projects as well. And I think certainly for us as an authority, we have an inward investment function. So most clusters, the cluster organisation, is not not a public body. It just happens by sort of not quite an accident of history, but a coincidence of history, let's say, that in Tees Valley, we as a public body ended up running the cluster plan and bringing together our industrial leadership group, which is a bit like your energy board, but it's not quite the same, but it is another group that came in off the back of cluster plans. So there we bring together the industrial partners to work together with a single voice to promote not only the decarbonisation of the Tees Valley, but to promote the Tees Valley as a place to come to and do green business. Mm-hmm. So we've got the cluster almost shouting up for inward investment in Teesside, and we've got our inward investment team for the region working not only in the same organisation and the same building, but in the same directorate as the engineers who are working to sort of deliver the cluster plan.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, David.
Yeah, so I think I would be fairly safe in asserting that the UK doesn't have a great reputation for building infrastructure. And I would assert also that we tend to, at the business case phase, underestimate the economic value that infrastructure is going to provide to the UK economy. And what we're starting to see in HyNet land, sort of up in the northwest, is so the original cluster concept was build infrastructure to decarbonise existing industry. So yeah, that was the concept, that was the plan. Our HyNet system is designed to do that. Government has now launched the Track 1 expansion process, and that is looking to plug new players into that network. So that is decarbonising some other existing industries, but we had 16 expressions of interest for HyNet Track 1 expansion, so oversubscribed in terms of pipeline capacity, sort of 3 or 4-fold. And what's really intrigued us is that a lot of those companies looking to build are global industrials looking to locate into the northwest because the infrastructure is going to be built. They could build anywhere in Europe, anywhere across the world. They're looking to build where CCS infrastructure is going to be built first. So going back to that sort of how do we value our business case, don't just value the business case on the status quo, value the business case on what extra additional investment that infrastructure will bring. And I think it's a really sort of salutary learning point for us all, and something which I sort of do try and sort of talk to Treasury about when we sit down with Treasury to say, look, the inward investment that will come, and I hate to use the phrase build it and they will come, but there is a real sort of evidence of that, I think, in the low carbon industries.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just probably make a comment because we've got quite a mixed audience here, and some people in the room have got an impression that these are just plans that are not delivering stuff. Just to make it clear, they are plans, but within the plan context, some massive infrastructure projects are being developed right now and supported through government and industry funding. So in the last budget, there was £20 billion announced towards decarbonising these clusters, and that's big infrastructure projects. So it's not just plans sitting there. The idea of these plans that the panel are talking about is that the industry project doesn't just sit there on its own, that it's part of a much wider context with lots and lots of other industries engaged and planning to use that infrastructure. So that's the basic idea, and sorry if that point got a little bit lost at the beginning. We're at an innovation conference, so a lot of the people in the room are really interested to know what you consider to be innovative about your cluster and the work that you've done. Philippa, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, surely. So one of the things was the scale, being able to look at things at scale and bring together all the partners that we needed. It's going back to this collaboration piece again. But that in itself is innovative, being able to discuss these things openly. We also were able to look at a whole range of different scenarios for decarbonisation. So we didn't just go, okay, with carbon capture and storage or fuel switching to hydrogen are the best solutions. We did some whole system studies across the industries in Scotland to see how combinations of energy efficiency, fuel switching, electrification, hydrogen, green and blue, and carbon capture and storage can enable decarbonisation. And we were able to reach net zero by 2045, which was one of the key findings that we had from the cluster plans. And then there's also some smaller pieces of innovation, and there's innovation from the deployment project as well. We've been looking at shipping and how to maximise the amount of CO2 you can get on board the ship through the clever design of the vessels. And And shipping's important in Scotland because, as I've said, we've got this huge amount of storage available. Scotland's emissions for industrial emissions are of the order of 10, 11 megatons per year. So that's a million tonnes per year. They're about a quarter of Scotland's emissions. Obviously, our first target is to store Scottish emissions and also to enable this inward investment by having that capability to take the CO2 away and deposit it safely offshore. But shipping from Europe and from the rest of the UK is also an option, and that's could be very valuable to Scotland as well.
Great, thanks. Matthew, you've got a completely different sort of challenge in your region with 3,000 businesses to talk to, so what have you got to say?
Yes, if I go back to my large numbers problem, I think a lot of the innovation in our project was around data and handling data and understanding what data could be shared and collaborated together with and what data was private and would not be collaborated with. And those are very short sentences, but there was an awful lot of work went into everyone understanding what they were prepared to share and what they weren't, and producing platforms that would do that, and maps that showed all these different locations and what you could work with others to share and minimise your carbon emissions. So I think there's a big data and platform IT kind of innovation agenda in this space.
Yeah, great, thank you. Chris?
So in addition to our investment in cluster planning, we sponsor innovation infrastructure across the region, and I know that actually the director of our Net Zero Centre is here in the audience. So TVCA contributed to the Net Zero Industry Innovation Centre at Teesside University, and it has facilities to help companies get through the I think they call it the valley of death in terms of the TRL levels. So to get sort of through TRL level 3 through 7 and into get really clever ideas out of universities and into production. That's that was we can't necessarily fund innovation ourselves, but we can fund the infrastructure that underpins it. But we've also partnered with Innovate UK on one of the 2 Launchpad pilots. So I know they're now planning more, but our Launchpad was a £7 million programme designed to support any emerging technology in that similar TRL level, where coming out of SMEs, usually heavily linked to the university or innovation space, and getting them to the next level and into production. And we saw some really interesting collaborations. So you had the likes of BP, or a Launchpad company, but they're working with exciting startups. And so you've got indigenous companies in the Tees Valley, small ones, working with the Net Zero Centre or the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, or any number of other innovation institutions, getting support from UK government via Innovate UK, and all of their projects are linked to cluster decarbonisation.
That's amazing, thank you. So I think one of the things people are interested also in hearing about is just thinking about the medium to longer term, and David, perhaps you could kick this off. How are you seeing government support for decarbonisation playing out as we look to the medium and long term? Are you optimistic?
Goodness me, now there's a question, isn't it? I'm not going to get into the politicisation of net zero and sort of culture wars and all of that good stuff, and elections coming up. So look, let's try and keep comments to the straight and narrow. I think the first thing to say is, the government will not be able to write a cheque for £20 billion every year for the next sort of 20 years to pay for large CCS and hydrogen projects. We need to find a mechanism. The government talk about sort of coming off subsidy, off support, and I think that's absolutely right. There is a good deal of government financial support for the initial clusters, for the infrastructure, execution and delivery, and that's not going to be around forever. So I think understanding what we can do to convert the existing sort of infrastructure deployment models, which are essentially based on state-backed sort of financial support, to more market-driven mechanisms. And ultimately for that, what do you need? You need a carbon price. And at the moment, the ETS is not functioning well enough to drive real investment in low-carbon infrastructure. So we need a stronger ETS price. I would argue strongly that that would be better combined with Europe, but clearly that's a political decision. I think we also need, once we have a strong ETS platform, so essentially a carbon price, we also need What government have talked about and are starting to move towards consultation on is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which essentially prevents low cost, high carbon products coming into the UK market. So there are some macroeconomic structures which need to be put in place to actually allow the investment to continue on a market-based forum. So I think we will start to see that over the next 2, 3, 4 years as the next step beyond the sort of current sort of subsidy-based mechanism.
Great, thank you. There's so many great questions came in on Slido. I'm sorry we couldn't get through them all. One of the questions was around how are the clusters collaborating together. So if you're interested in finding out about that, we did write a brilliant report last year based on the work all the clusters have done. I've got a QR code for that report if you want to just let me know. And then the other thing to say is if you go up the main aisle towards the main stage, then on the Innovate UK stand, each of the clusters has got a great video showing on our stand, so you can see all of them playing out there, and also South Wales as well, who can be with us today. Thank you so much to the panel. It's been brilliant, and thank you to all of you.